Hey guys, so you think being a ninja in ancient Japan sounds exciting? Picture this. You're crouching in a cramped ceiling space for 6 hours straight, breathing in air so thick with dust and mouse droppings that every breath tastes like the back of a cupboard that hasn't been opened in decades. Your legs have gone numb an hour ago, and now you're trying not to sneeze while a family directly below you eats their dinner, completely unaware that you're up there clenching every muscle in your body just to stay silent. And that's just Tuesday. Or imagine spending an entire night buried up to your neck in cold mud by a riverbank, waiting to ambush someone, while insects you can't even see take turns biting every exposed bit of your face. No phone to scroll through, no snacks, just you, the mud, and the growing certainty that this seemed like a much better idea 6 hours ago. If you're enjoying this already, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical reality checks. And I'm genuinely curious to know where you're watching from, so tell me in the comments what time it is and where you are in the world right now. So let's step into the world of an ancient Japanese ninja and find out exactly why you wouldn't last a single week. Let's start with your living situation, because forget whatever you've seen in films. You're not living in some mysterious mountain fortress with elegant sliding doors and peaceful gardens. Most ninja operated in complete secrecy, which meant your home was usually a tiny, cramped space that doubled as your workshop, your armory, and your bedroom all at once. We're talking about a room barely bigger than a modern disabled toilet, with a ceiling so low you'd bang your head every single morning until you learned to move in a permanent crouch. The walls were paper thin, literally made of paper and wood, so every sound from the neighbours came through crystal clear. You'd hear everything from arguments to digestion problems, and you'd have to stay absolutely silent yourself, because the whole point of being a ninja was that nobody knew you were a ninja. Storage was a nightmare. You owned rope, grappling hooks, climbing spikes, various disguises, weapons, poisons, and all the tools of your trade. All of this had to be hidden in a space the size of a small wardrobe. You'd get creative, hollowing out floorboards and creating secret compartments, which sounds clever until you realize you're essentially living on top of a pile of sharp metal objects separated from your sleeping mat by ½ an inch of wood. Roll over the wrong way in your sleep and you'd wake up with a climbing spike jabbing you in the ribs. The smell in these hiding spots was something special too, because metal and rope stored in damp, enclosed spaces developed this musty metallic tang that clung to everything you owned. Your clothes reeked of it. Your hands always had that iron smell that wouldn't wash off. Speaking of washing, let's talk about personal hygiene when you're supposed to be invisible. You couldn't just pop down to the local bathhouse whenever you fancied, because bathhouses were social spaces where people talked and gossiped. Going regularly meant being seen regularly, which meant people might start recognizing you, asking questions, remembering your face. For someone whose entire profession depended on being forgettable and anonymous, that was a disaster. So you washed in your tiny room using a bucket of cold water that you'd hauled from the nearest well, trying to scrub off days of accumulated grime while crouching in a space barely big enough to sit down in. The water turned grey almost immediately. You'd use the same bucket to wash your clothes, your body, and occasionally your tools, in whatever order seemed most practical that day. Your diet was specifically designed to be bland and non-aromatic, because the last thing you needed while hiding in someone's ceiling was for your body to start producing noticeable smells. That meant no garlic, no strong spices, nothing that would make you gassy or give you distinctive body odor. You ate a lot of rice, some vegetables, occasionally some fish, if you could get it cheap and plain. Everything was steamed or boiled into submission until it had roughly the same texture and taste as wet paper. Imagine eating the same meal of plain rice and boiled vegetables every single day for months on end. No salt, because that made you thirsty, and you couldn't always drink water when you were on a mission. No interesting flavors whatsoever. Your taste buds would essentially give up and go dormant. Food became pure fuel, about as exciting as filling up a vehicle. The monotony of this diet did strange things to your body. Your stomach would produce these odd rumbling sounds at unexpected times because it was so used to processing the same bland mush that anything even slightly different would set it off. You'd be hiding in perfect silence, and your abdomen would suddenly decide to gurgle like a blocked drain. There was nothing you could do except clench everything and hope nobody heard. Some ninja would fast before important missions just to ensure their digestive system stayed completely quiet, which meant going into dangerous situations already weak and hollow-bellied. The hunger pangs were intense, like having an angry small animal trapped in your stomach scratching to get out. Let's talk about your actual missions now, because this is where things got properly uncomfortable. A huge part of ninja work was reconnaissance, which is a fancy word for standing very still in uncomfortable places for extremely long periods. You'd be assigned to watch a particular house or person, which meant finding a hiding spot and not moving from it for 6, 8, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. Popular hiding spots included ceiling spaces, under floorboards, in ditches, up trees and barrels, inside storage sheds, and buried in shallow holes covered with branches. None of these were designed for human comfort. Ceiling spaces were hot, airless, and full of dust that coated your throat and nostrils. Every breath felt like inhaling a dry sponge. The dust settled on your skin, mixing with sweat to form this grimy layer that itched ferociously, but you couldn't scratch because any movement might make a sound or dislodge dust onto the people below. Under floorboards was somehow worse. The space was even more cramped, pressing in on all sides like a coffin. It was damp down there, and cold, and home to every spider and beetle that had ever wanted a dark place to live. Things crawled over you constantly. You'd feel the tickle of insect legs on your neck, your arms, across your face, and you'd have to just accept it as part of the job. Sometimes you'd feel something bite you, a sharp little pinch, and you'd lie there knowing a lump was forming, but unable to do anything about it. By the time you emerged hours later, you'd be covered in bites and bumps, your skin a topographical map of misery. Tree hiding was cold and exposed you to weather. Rain would soak you to the bone while you clung to wet bark, trying not to shiver visibly. Wind would whip through your clothes, which were usually dark and thin to avoid being spotted. Your fingers would go numb wrapped around branches, your legs would cramp from maintaining an unnatural position, and birds would occasionally take exception to your presence. Getting dive-bombed by an angry bird when you're trying to remain invisible and silent is a uniquely frustrating experience. You just have to take it, letting this bird peck at your head while you stayed frozen, probably wondering how your life had led to this exact moment. Ditches meant lying in mud and stagnant water, breathing through a hollow reed if the water was deep enough. The mud was usually the consistency of cold porridge mixed with old leaves and things that used to be alive but weren't anymore. It would seep through your clothes immediately, coating your skin in a layer of clammy cold grime that sucked all the warmth from your body. After an hour, you'd lose feeling in your extremities. After 3 hours, you'd wonder if you'd ever be warm again. The smell was something else entirely, a rich mixture of decomposition and minerals and standing water that got into your nose and mouth and stayed there for days afterwards. You'd still be tasting swamp a week later. Now let's discuss the clothing situation. because what you wore as a ninja would make modern workout gear feel like luxury bedding. Forget the stylish black outfits from films. Most of the time, you wore whatever helped you blend in with your current disguise, which meant layers of rough, scratchy fabric that hadn't seen any kind of fabric softener, because that hadn't been invented yet. We're talking about hemp and cotton so coarse it could double as light sandpaper. This stuff rubbed against your skin with every movement, creating friction points at your armpits, your thighs, anywhere fabric met skin repeatedly. Within a few hours of activity, you develop raw patches that stung with every step. After a full day, those patches would be angry and inflamed, making the next day even more uncomfortable. When you did wear your actual working outfit for night missions, it was typically dark blue rather than black, because pure black actually stands out more at night. This outfit was designed to be close-fitting to avoid snagging on things, which meant it was essentially a full-body stocking made of that same rough material. Imagine wearing scratchy long underwear as your entire outfit, with no comfortable layer underneath because extra layers meant extra bulk and extra noise. The fabric would stick to you when you sweated, which was constantly, creating this clammy second skin that felt like being hugged by a cold, damp towel. In summer, you'd overheat immediately. In winter, the thin material provided almost no insulation, and the moisture from your sweat would actually make you colder. Your footwear deserves special mention because it was essentially a split toe sock with a thin sole. These things were called tabi, and while they were excellent for climbing and moving quietly, they provided about as much cushioning as wearing paper bags on your feet. Every stone you stepped on transmitted its full presence directly into your soul. Walking across gravel felt like a medieval torture method. Long-distance travel meant your feet took an absolute beating, developing hard calluses on the balls and heels. But before those calluses formed properly, you'd go through weeks of tender, bruised feet that hurt with every step. The split-toe design also meant you'd occasionally catch the gap between your toes on things, which is a uniquely annoying sensation, like a permanent wedgie but for your feet. Let's talk about rope work, because climbing was a huge part of the job, and it was nowhere near as graceful as it looks in demonstrations. Real rope made from natural fibers was rough, rigid, and actively hostile to human hands. Climbing a rope meant gripping something that felt like twisted wood covered in splinters. Every time you hauled yourself up, the rope would scrape against your palms, your fingers, the inside of your thighs if you were using your legs to grip. You'd develop blisters within the first few climbs, big fluid-filled bubbles on your palms that would burst during the next climb, leaving raw patches that would then have to toughen up into calluses. This process took weeks and was agonizing throughout, but you couldn't just stop climbing because your hands hurt. Missions required scaling walls, climbing into windows, descending from roofs. You'd wrap your torn hands around that hostile rope and pull yourself up anyway, feeling every fiber scraping against raw flesh. Some ninja would coat their hands in various substances to toughen the skin faster. Folk remedies involving tree sap or particular plant extracts, but these often stung worse than the original problem. Your hands would essentially become leather over time, so thick and calloused that you'd lose fine sensation in your fingertips. This was necessary for the job, but meant that touching anything with your bare hands felt distant and muffled, like wearing gloves made of your own skin. The tools of your trade were uncomfortable in their own special ways. You carried climbing spikes that strapped to your hands and feet, turning you into a human gecko, but also meaning you had metal spikes jutting from your limbs that you had to be constantly aware of. Scratch your nose wrong and you jab yourself in the face. These spikes attached with leather straps that had to be tight enough to stay secure during climbing, which meant they cut off circulation if worn too long. You'd climb a wall and reach the top with hands and feet that had gone partially numb and tingly from restricted circulation. Then you'd have to perform delicate, precise tasks with fingers that felt like fat sausages, all while perched somewhere you absolutely could not afford to lose your grip. Your weapons were designed for concealment rather than comfort. Short swords and daggers had minimal hand guards because large guards would be visible under clothing. This meant that in actual use, if your hand slipped even slightly forward on the grip, you'd catch your fingers on the blade edge. Not deeply, but enough to sting and make your grip slippery. Throwing stars, those iconic ninja weapons, had to be carried somewhere they wouldn't stab you but could be accessed quickly. Popular carrying spots included special pockets, wrapped in cloth inside your outfit, or in pouches that hung in awkward positions. None of these were comfortable. You'd have hard metal shapes pressing against your body, and if you moved wrong, you'd get jabbed by your own equipment. Running with a full set of throwing stars in various pockets felt like jogging with drawer full of cutlery strapped to your torso. Chains and weighted weapons were even worse. These had to be wrapped carefully to prevent noise and tangling, but that meant carrying several pounds of metal chain coiled against your body. The weight would pull at wherever you'd secured it, creating sore spots and making you list to one side if you weren't careful. Unwrapping a chain weapon in the dark quickly and silently, while possibly in danger, was a skill that took ages to master, and even then sometimes resulted in dropping the entire thing or getting tangled in your own weapon like the world's least funny comedy routine. Let's discuss the wonderful topic of infiltration via tight spaces. Buildings had all sorts of small gaps and passages that a determined person could squeeze through, and ninja were expected to be experts at this. That meant regularly compressing your body into spaces that were absolutely not designed for human occupation. You'd force yourself through gaps in walls, under buildings, through foundation spaces, into storage areas via openings meant for ventilation. Every one of these tight squeezes was claustrophobic and uncomfortable in unique ways. Crawling under a building meant dragging yourself on your belly through a space maybe 2 feet high, in complete darkness, with the floor joists pressing into your back and the ground scraping your front. You'd inch forward using your elbows and knees, unable to see where you were going, feeling spider webs brush across your face with every foot of progress. The air under buildings was stale and thick with the smell of damp earth and old timber. Your breathing would sound deafening in that enclosed space, and you'd be hyper-aware that you were underneath tons of building that was held up by wooden posts, some of which were probably not in great condition. Every creak and settling noise would spike your anxiety, even though buildings made those noises all the time. Squeezing through narrow wall gaps meant turning sideways and shuffling, with rough wood scraping your chest and back simultaneously. You'd get stuck sometimes, your outfit caught on a splinter, or your equipment snagged on a protrusion, and you'd have to work yourself free without panicking or making noise. The sensation of being wedged in a tight space with no easy way to move forward or back would trigger every instinctive fear of confinement. You'd fight down the urge to thrash and force yourself to move slowly and methodically, even though every part of your brain was screaming at you to get out of this space immediately. Let's move on to the delightful subject of disguises, because a huge part of ninja work involved not looking like a ninja at all. You'd spend most of your time disguised as ordinary people, which meant adopting their appearance, their mannerisms, and their professions convincingly enough that nobody would look twice at you. This wasn't just putting on a different outfit. This was becoming an entirely different person, often for days or weeks at a time, while maintaining your cover under scrutiny. The physical discomfort of this was substantial and constant. Common disguises included merchants, traveling priests, performers, beggars, and laborers. Each came with its own special miseries. Disguising yourself as a merchant meant carrying actual goods to sell, because a merchant without merchandise was immediately suspicious. You'd haul around a heavy pack of items, your shoulders aching from the straps, your back protesting the uneven weight. You'd have to actually sell things too, interacting with people, haggling, making conversation, all while remembering your fake background story and staying alert for your actual mission objectives. Your feet would hurt from standing in marketplaces all day. Your voice would get hoarse from calling out to potential customers, and you'd have to maintain this performance every single day until your mission was complete. The traveling priest disguise involves shaving your head completely, which sounds simple until you realize that maintaining a shaved head in an era without mirrors or good razors was a nightmare. You'd have to shave by touch, using a blade sharp enough to cut hair but trying not to slice your scalp open in the process. Miss a spot, and you'd have these random patches of stubble that would give you away. Cut yourself, and you'd have tender nicks all over your head that would sting when you sweated, which was always. The priest outfit was usually rough, plain robes that marked you as someone who'd taken vows of poverty, which meant the fabric was deliberately uncomfortable as a form of spiritual discipline. You'd wear these scratchy robes in all weather, sweating in summer, freezing in winter, and having to maintain a calm, spiritual demeanor the whole time, even though you were actually casing someone's house or listening for information. Performer disguises were physically demanding in completely different ways. Musicians had to actually play instruments competently, which meant your fingers took a beating from strings or drumming. Acrobats and street entertainers had to perform physically demanding routines multiple times a day to maintain their cover. Imagine having to do backflips and juggling routines when your actual job that morning involved climbing a wall and hiding in a ceiling for 6 hours. You'd be exhausted before you even started your performance, but you'd have to smile and cartwheel and make it look effortless because that's what the crowd expected. Your muscles would be screaming, your joints would be protesting, and you'd have to stick the landing on your 10th backflip of the day while internally cursing every decision that led you to this profession. The beggar disguise was perhaps the most unpleasant in terms of pure sensory awfulness. To convincingly portray someone destitute, you had to look and smell the part. That meant not washing, deliberately dirtying your clothes and skin, and generally making yourself as unappealing as possible so people would avoid looking at you too closely. You'd rub dirt into your clothes, your hair, your skin, creating layers of grime that would itch constantly. You'd go days without washing, letting your natural body odor develop into something truly impressive. Your hair would get greasy and matted, your fingernails would accumulate dirt crescents, your teeth would feel fuzzy and unpleasant. The smell would get into your nose so you couldn't escape it even for a moment, a constant reminder of your current state. And you'd have to sit in one spot for hours begging, which meant remaining stationary in all weather. Rain would soak you and you'd have to stay there, shivering and dripping. Sun would beat down and you'd have no shade, feeling your skin burn and your mouth go dry. People would walk past and sometimes kick dirt at you or curse at you, because that's how many people treated beggars. And you'd have to accept it without reacting because breaking character meant blowing your cover. Your rear would go numb from sitting on hard ground, then painful, then numb again, in a cycle that repeated throughout the day. All of this while you were actually observing a target, tracking movements, noting patterns, doing mental work that required focus, while your body dealt with a cascade of discomforts. Let's talk about the joys of remaining motionless for extended periods, because this was a core ninja skill, and it was absolutely terrible for your body. When you're hiding and observing, you often couldn't move at all for hours. The human body is not designed for this. We're meant to shift position, stretch, adjust our weight. Denying these natural impulses created cumulative discomfort that built to almost unbearable levels. It would start with minor itches. Your nose would itch, Your ear would itch. A spot on your back would develop the most intense, focused itch you'd ever experienced, like a tiny demon was scratching that exact spot with a tiny demon fork. You couldn't scratch any of these. You'd have to ignore them, let them scream for attention while you stayed frozen. The itch would intensify, plateau, then slowly fade, only to pop up somewhere else. This would continue for the entire duration of your hiding period, a roving carnival of itches that you couldn't address. Then the aches would start. Your muscles, held in one position, would begin to protest. First with a mild discomfort, then a persistent ache, then a deep, throbbing pain that radiated through entire limbs. Your joints would stiffen, fluid settling in ways that made movement difficult, even when you were finally allowed to shift. Crouching for hours meant your knees would lock up, the joint feeling like someone had poured concrete into it. Standing very still meant your lower back would develop a band of tight pain across the base of your spine. Lying flat meant your shoulders would start to hurt, then your hips, then every point of contact between your body and the ground. Circulation would become an issue. Limbs would fall asleep, that pins and needles sensation spreading through hands or feet or entire legs. You'd lose feeling in extremities, which was dangerous because you needed to be able to move quickly and precisely if your cover was blown. But you couldn't flex or move to restore circulation. You'd just have to wait it out, feeling the tingling progress from uncomfortable to painful, knowing that when you finally did move, the returning circulation would hurt even worse as feeling flooded back into dormant limbs. Your breathing would become a focus of constant attention. Breathing too deeply made noise and caused visible movement. Breathing too shallowly meant you'd start feeling lightheaded and desperate for air. You'd have to find this perfect middle ground, shallow enough to be silent, but deep enough to actually oxygenate your body and maintain it for hours. This level of breath control was exhausting mentally, requiring constant focus that drained your energy, even though you weren't physically moving. The urge to cough, sneeze, or clear your throat would strike at the worst possible times. Dust in your nose would trigger that pre-sneeze tickle, and you'd have to suppress it through sheer will, pressing your tongue to the roof of your mouth, breathing slowly through the sensation until it passed. The effort of suppressing a sneeze was surprisingly intense, your whole body tensing against the reflex, leaving you shaking slightly from the exertion. Coughs were worse because they often came from actual irritation in your throat, meaning the urge would return repeatedly. You'd swallow over and over trying to calm the tickle, feeling your throat get drier and more irritated with each suppressed cough. Now we should discuss the delightful reality of gathering intelligence, which sounds mysterious and exciting, but mostly involves sitting very still in uncomfortable places while eavesdropping on incredibly boring conversations. You'd position yourself near where your targets would talk, maybe in an adjacent room, in the ceiling above them, or outside near a window, and then you'd wait for them to say something useful. This could take hours, days even, and most of what you'd overhear would be completely mundane household discussions about meals, servants, weather, minor complaints, family gossip, nothing remotely connected to your mission. You'd listen to someone drone on about their garden troubles for 20 minutes, while you're cramped in a ceiling space with a roof beam pressing into your kidney. You'd hear detailed discussions about fabric quality for new clothes, while your leg slowly falls asleep beneath you. You'd endure long conversations about somebody's digestive complaints while you're trying not to breathe too loudly in your hiding spot. And you'd have to pay attention to all of it, because you never knew when something actually relevant might come up. You couldn't zone out or daydream. Every word had to be processed and remembered, because you had no way to take notes while hiding. The mental fatigue of this was enormous. Sustained concentration for hours on end, listening carefully to conversations that were mostly meaningless, straining to hear properly through walls or floors or distance, trying to remember exact phrases and details. Your mind would start to wander despite your best efforts, and you'd suddenly realize you'd missed the last 2 minutes of conversation and had no idea if something important was said. This would spike your anxiety, making you refocus with renewed intensity, which would exhaust you faster, creating a cycle of attention and drift that was mentally draining. Position would become agony during these long listening sessions. We've talked about staying still, but it bears repeating because intelligence gathering took this to extreme durations. 6 hours crouched in a ceiling, 8 hours pressed into a narrow gap in a wall, 10 hours curled in a storage space. Your body would progress through discomfort to pain to a sort of numb acceptance that everything hurt and always would hurt, and this was just your existence now. You'd lose track of individual aches as they blended into a general state of misery that encompassed your entire physical being. Thirst was particularly brutal during these sessions. You couldn't bring water into most hiding spots because containers made noise when they sloshed. Your mouth would go dry, your throat would start to stick, your tongue would feel thick and fuzzy. Swallowing would become difficult and unpleasant. You'd produce less saliva, making your mouth feel like it was coated in chalk dust. The thirst would progress from uncomfortable to painful, a burning sensation in your throat that distracted from everything else, and you'd still have hours to go before you could safely leave and drink something. Hunger was another constant companion on long surveillance missions. Your stomach would move through several stages of complaint. First, the gentle growling we've discussed, then a hollow, empty feeling like your stomach was trying to digest itself. Then actual cramping pains as your digestive system protested the lack of input. These cramps could be intense, doubling you over if you weren't careful to breathe through them and maintain position. The pain would come in waves, building to a peak, then subsiding, then returning 10 minutes later, all while you're trying to concentrate on listening to conversations about fish prices or some other equally riveting topic. Let's talk about the fantastic experience of emergency hiding when you were almost discovered. Sometimes you'd be moving through a building and hear unexpected footsteps, or someone would enter a room you were searching, or a guard would appear where no guard was supposed to be. You'd have to hide immediately, diving into whatever concealment was available with no time to choose or prepare. This meant ending up in truly terrible hiding spots, contorted into positions that were painful within seconds. Behind furniture was a common emergency hide, which meant flattening yourself in the narrow gap between a cabinet and a wall, or under a low table, or behind a screen. These spaces were designed for storage or aesthetics, not human occupation. You'd be twisted like a pretzel, one arm trapped beneath you, one leg bent at an angle no leg should bend, your neck craned awkwardly because the space wasn't quite tall enough, and you'd have to stay there, perfectly silent and still, while whoever had almost discovered you went about their business in the room. Could be 2 minutes, could be 20. You'd have no way of knowing how long you'd be stuck in this agonizing position. The person might sit down and start writing or reading or just thinking. They might take a nap right there in the room while you're folded behind a cabinet, trying not to whimper from the pain shooting through your compressed limbs. Every second would feel like an hour. Your muscles would scream. Your joints would protest violently. You'd want nothing more than to shift even slightly to relieve the pressure on that one particular nerve that was firing pain signals like a drummer with unlimited energy. But any movement meant discovery, which meant mission failure, which likely meant something very bad for you. So you'd stay frozen in your pretzel configuration, exploring new frontiers of discomfort. Breathing became a major challenge during emergency hiding, because fear and pain both made you want to breathe faster and deeper. But deep breathing made noise and caused movement. You'd have to consciously slow and shallow your breathing while your body was demanding more oxygen to deal with stress. This contradiction created its own form of panic, a suffocating feeling even though you were technically getting enough air. Your chest would feel tight, your heart would pound, and you'd have to use mental discipline to override every physical instinct telling you to take a deep, gulping breath. Now let's discuss the joys of rooftop navigation, because roofs were highways for ninja and they were spectacularly uncomfortable highways. Roof tiles in ancient Japan were ceramic or wood, arranged in overlapping rows that created a surface that was simultaneously slippery and uneven. Moving across a roof meant distributing your weight carefully to avoid breaking tiles or making noise, while also dealing with the fact that you were walking on an angled surface made of materials that really didn't want to provide traction. Tiles would shift under your feet, making little grinding noises that seemed deafeningly loud in the night quiet. You'd freeze every time a tile moved, waiting to see if anyone below had heard, feeling your heart hammering while you balanced on one foot on an angled surface. Your ankles would be flexed at awkward angles to keep your feet flat against the slope, straining muscles that weren't designed for this kind of sustained, odd positioning. After an hour of roof travel, your lower legs would burn with fatigue, the muscles trembling from constant micro-adjustments to maintain balance. The angle of roofs meant you were essentially always walking uphill or downhill, never on a flat surface. Uphill sections required pulling yourself up using your hands as much as your legs, gripping roof ridges or architectural features, feeling the rough ceramic or weathered wood bite into your palms. Downhill sections were even worse because gravity wanted to speed you up, but speed meant noise. You'd descend in a controlled crouch, your thighs burning from the effort of slowing your descent, your toes jammed into your thin-soled footwear as they took all the braking force. Let's discuss the wonderful world of maintaining your equipment, because your tools required constant care, and all of it was tedious, uncomfortable, and frequently smelly. Rope needed to be checked for wear and kept dry because damp rope would rot and fail when you really needed it not to. That meant inspecting every inch of every rope regularly, looking for fraying or weak spots, feeling for damage with your sensitized fingers. This took hours and was mind-numbingly boring, but skipping it could literally mean a fatal fall later. Metal tools and weapons needed to be kept rust-free, which meant regular oiling. The oil used wasn't some pleasant modern formula, it was whatever worked, often rendered animal fat or particular plant oils that had distinct and unpleasant smells. You'd rub this smelly substance onto every metal surface, coating your hands in the process, getting the scent into your skin where it would linger for days. The combination of metal tang and rancid oil smell would cling to your hands no matter how much you wash them. Everything you touched would pick up a hint of it. Every meal would taste slightly of it because your hands were bringing food to your mouth. Sharpening blades was a regular necessity and a process that took significant time and effort. You'd sit with a whetstone, drawing the blade across it at the correct angle over and over and over. The sound was a rhythmic scraping that went on for ages, the stone gradually wearing down the metal to reform the edge. Your arms would get tired from the repetitive motion. Your back would ache from hunching over your work. The metal dust and stone particles would get into the air, giving you a metallic taste in your mouth and making your nose feel dry and irritated. Checking and repairing your outfit was endless work, because the rough activities you engaged in were constantly damaging the fabric. Small tears from climbing, worn spots from friction, seams that were coming apart from stress. You'd sit with needle and thread, squinting in poor light to make tiny stitches, your fingertips sore from pushing the needle through tough fabric. Sewing was not considered a particularly masculine activity in many contexts, so you'd have learned it purely out of necessity and probably weren't very good at it. Your repairs would be functional but ugly, lumpy seams and uneven stitches that you could feel against your skin when you wore the garment. Thread would break constantly because the stuff available wasn't great quality. You'd be halfway through a seam and the thread would snap, meaning you'd have to start over, rethreading the needle with fingers that were already sore and in light that was already inadequate. The frustration of this simple task going wrong repeatedly was immense. You'd sit there, trying to thread a needle by candlelight, missing the eye over and over, feeling your temper fray along with your equipment. Now let's talk about the fantastic experience of dealing with actual ninja training maintenance as an adult, because you couldn't let your skills deteriorate. This meant regular practice of all the uncomfortable things we've discussed, deliberately putting yourself through discomfort to maintain proficiency. You'd practice hiding in cramped spaces even when you didn't have to, forcing yourself to stay motionless in uncomfortable positions for hours as training. This was volunteering for misery, choosing to be in pain to ensure you could handle it when it mattered. Climbing practice meant your hands and feet were constantly torn up. Just when blisters would start to heal and calluses would form, you'd do another intensive practice session and damage them again. The cycle never fully ended. Your palms were permanent maps of abuse, thick calluses interspersed with healing cracks and tender spots. Gripping anything firmly would produce a dull ache as damaged tissue compressed. Your feet were the same, hardened and beaten, with areas of thickness that would catch on fabric when you walked barefoot. Balance and agility training was its own form of ongoing torture. You'd walk across narrow beams, jump between posts, practice landing silently from various heights. This was basically asking to turn your ankles repeatedly. You'd misjudge a landing and roll your ankle, sending a spike of pain up your leg and leaving you limping for days. But you couldn't take days off to heal, because that would let your skills deteriorate. So you'd train on a sore ankle, compensating with your other leg, which would then get overworked and develop its own problems. Your knees would ache from the constant impact of landing jumps. Your hips would be sore from the lateral movements and sudden changes of direction. Flexibility maintenance was crucial because you needed to fit into tight spaces and contort into hiding positions. This meant regular stretching, which is uncomfortable even in modern contexts with cushioned mats and guided instruction. You'd be doing it on hard floors, pushing your body to bend in ways it didn't want to, feeling the burn and pull of resistant muscles and tendons. Some stretches required holding painful positions for extended periods to make progress. You'd be folded in half, feeling your hamstrings protest vocally, holding the position until they relax slightly, then pushing a little farther into the pain. This was necessary, but never pleasant. Breath control practice meant deliberately restricting your breathing to extend how long you could hold your breath, or how shallowly you could breathe while remaining functional. You'd sit and breathe as minimally as possible, feeling your body start to panic from insufficient oxygen, fighting down the urge to gasp, extending your limits gradually. The sensation of air hunger is deeply unpleasant, triggering primal survival responses that scream at you to breathe deeply now. Overriding this repeatedly for training was mentally exhausting and physically uncomfortable, leaving you slightly dizzy and with a pounding headache. Let's discuss the joys of information gathering through social interaction, which meant spending time in public spaces like markets, tea houses and gathering spots, listening to gossip and rumours while maintaining whatever disguise you were using. This sounds easier than physical infiltration, but came with its own set of problems. You had to be social and engaging enough to hear useful information, but not so memorable that people would later recall your presence. This balancing act required constant mental effort and was exhausting in its own way. Tea houses were common gathering spots and absolutely reeked. The smell of spilled tea that had soaked into wooden floors, combined with the body odour of dozens of people in an enclosed space with poor ventilation, created an atmosphere that was thick enough to taste. The rooms would be hot from body heat and steam from tea preparation, making everyone sweat, which fed back into the overall atmosphere of human musk. You'd sit in this fragrant environment for hours, sipping tea you didn't particularly want, listening to conversations around you, trying to look relaxed while actually being intensely focused. The tea itself would bloat you after a while. You'd need to drink periodically to maintain your cover as a customer, but after your 5th cup your stomach would be sloshing with liquid, and you'd desperately need to relieve yourself. But leaving too frequently would be noticed, so you'd sit there with an increasingly urgent bladder, trying to focus on intelligence gathering, while a significant portion of your attention was consumed by the growing pressure in your lower abdomen. When you finally could excuse yourself, the relief would be intense but brief, because you'd know you'd need to drink more tea and the cycle would begin again. Let's move on to the delightful topic of weather exposure, because your work didn't stop for rain, snow, heat, or any other meteorological inconvenience. You'd be out in all conditions, and your minimal, functional clothing provided almost no protection from the elements. Rain would soak through your outfit within minutes, the thin fabric offering no water resistance whatsoever. The water would be cold, drawing heat from your body rapidly. You'd feel it trickling down your spine, pooling in the small of your back, running down your legs into your inadequate footwear. Wet fabric would cling to your skin, creating constant clammy contact that was miserable and distracting. The material would chafe worse when wet, rubbing against your skin with enhanced friction that would create raw spots within hours. Your hands would wrinkle and soften from constant moisture exposure, the skin becoming tender and easily damaged. Climbing with waterlogged hands meant your grip was worse, and the rope would slip more easily, making everything more dangerous. The cold would seep deep into your muscles, making them stiff and uncooperative, slowing your movements and making precise actions difficult. After a night in the rain, you'd return to your small space and need to dry out. But in a tiny room with poor ventilation, drying wet clothes was a nightmare. You'd hang them up and they'd stay damp for days, developing a mildew smell that would never quite wash out. The moisture in the enclosed space would make everything feel damp. Your sleeping mat would absorb humidity from the air, feeling cold and slightly wet when you lay down. You'd essentially never be fully dry during rainy seasons, living in a state of permanent dampness that made you more susceptible to all sorts of minor infections and skin problems. Summer heat was oppressive in different ways. Your dark working outfit would absorb sunlight when you were scouting locations during the day, turning into a personal oven that cooked you from the outside in. Sweat would pour off you in volumes that seemed impossible for one human body to produce. It would run into your eyes, stinging and blurring your vision. It would soak through your clothes, creating dark patches that would be visible if anyone looked closely. The salt from dried sweat would crystallize in the fabric, creating scratchy deposits that would irritate your skin. You'd develop heat rash in any area where fabric met skin and friction occurred, angry red bumps that itched intensely and hurt when you scratched them. Dehydration was a constant risk in hot weather, because you'd be sweating out water faster than you could safely replace it during missions. You couldn't just drink whenever you wanted, because finding safe water sources took time and made noise. Your mouth would become dry, your lips would crack and bleed, your thinking would get fuzzy as your brain struggled with insufficient hydration. The headaches from dehydration were particularly cruel, a pounding pain behind your eyes that made concentration difficult, but which you had to push through because your mission didn't care how much your head hurt. Winter brought its own catalogue of miseries. The cold would penetrate your thin outfit effortlessly, the minimal fabric providing essentially no insulation. Your extremities would go numb within an hour of exposure, fingers and toes losing feeling until you weren't sure if you still had them or not. This was dangerous because you needed manual dexterity for your work. You'd try to manipulate tools or weapons with fingers that felt like frozen sausages, thick and unresponsive. Fine motor control would be impossible. You'd fumble simple tasks, dropping things, unable to feel what you were holding. The cold would make you need to empty your bladder more frequently, which was spectacularly inconvenient when you were hiding somewhere you couldn't leave. You'd feel the pressure building, increasingly urgent, while you were stuck in a ceiling space or behind a wall. The discomfort would become acute, a painful urgency that consumed your attention. You'd have to use breathing techniques and mental discipline to manage the sensation, essentially meditating on not thinking about your bladder, while that was the only thing you could think about. If you absolutely couldn't hold it and couldn't leave your position, well, that created its own set of problems involving wet, cold fabric against your skin and the mortification of having to deal with the aftermath. Frostbite was a real risk during extended winter operations. You'd start to lose feeling in your nose, your ears, your fingers and toes. The flesh would turn white and waxy looking. Later, when you finally got somewhere warm, the returning sensation would be excruciating, a burning, stabbing pain as circulation returned to damaged tissue. The affected areas would be hypersensitive for days afterwards, hurting disproportionately when touched or exposed to any temperature change. Severe frostbite could lead to permanent damage, and you'd know ninja who'd lost parts of fingers or toes to the cold, their bodies bearing the permanent marks of winters spent motionless in inadequate clothing. Let's discuss the wonderful experience of urban navigation, because cities were both your primary operating environment and a constant obstacle course of discomfort. Streets were unpaved in most areas, meaning mud when wet and dust when dry. The mud would suck at your feet with every step, requiring extra effort to walk through. It would coat your footwear and lower legs, adding weight and creating a filthy, cold layer that would dry into a crusty shell. The smell of urban mud was distinctive, a mixture of earth, animal waste and decomposing vegetable matter from discarded food. This fragrant paste would work its way between your toes, squelching with every step. Dust was somehow worse because it got everywhere and into everything. Walking through dry streets would kick up clouds of fine particles that would coat your skin, get in your hair, and most annoyingly, get into your respiratory system. You'd be coughing and sneezing from the irritation, which was terrible for someone who needed to remain unnoticed. The dust would mix with sweat on your skin, creating a gritty paste that would accumulate in any crease or fold of your body. Your neck, behind your ears, in your armpits, between your toes, all would develop crusty deposits of dust mud that itched and irritated. Crowds were necessary for anonymity, but physically unpleasant. Bodies packed together in narrow streets meant constant unwanted contact. You'd be pressed against strangers, feeling their sweat, their breath, their body heat. The combined smell of dozens of people who bathed infrequently and wore clothes that were washed rarely created an atmosphere that was truly remarkable. Layer upon layer of human musk, mixed with whatever people had been doing that day. Fish sellers smelled of fish. Waste collectors smelled predictably terrible. Dye workers smelled of chemicals. Everyone contributed their own notes to the aromatic symphony. Being in crowds also meant being stepped on, elbowed and generally battered by the press of bodies. Taller people would hit you with their elbows at face level when they gestured. Shorter people would step backwards onto your feet without warning. Children would dart between legs and collide with your knees. Everyone was moving at different speeds in different directions, creating a chaotic flow that you had to navigate while trying to look natural and relaxed. The physical contact and jostling was constant and exhausting, keeping you in a perpetual state of low-level annoyance. Now let's talk about the remarkable experience of information dead drops and covert communication, because you couldn't just send a text message when you discovered something important. Communication with your handlers or other ninja required elaborate, uncomfortable procedures that added yet another layer of difficulty to everything. Dead drops were common, hidden locations where you'd leave information or receive instructions. These were often in extremely inconvenient places that required effort to access and offered no comfort whatsoever. A classic dead drop location might be a loose stone in a wall, a hollow in a tree, under a specific floorboard in a shrine, or inside a marker post. Accessing these meant going to specific locations at specific times, often in poor weather or at awkward hours, and retrieving or leaving items without being observed doing so. You'd need to approach casually, as if you just happened to be passing through, then find a moment when no one was looking to make your move. This could mean loitering in an area for an hour or more, waiting for a clear moment, standing around trying to look purposeless, while your feet hurt and you needed to visit the toilet. The actual retrieval would be quick but stressful. You'd reach into the hiding spot, your fingers encountering spider webs, dust, sometimes insects, that had made the space their home. The message or item would be wrapped in cloth or paper to protect it, but the hiding spot itself was usually dirty and unpleasant. You'd pull out what you needed, trying to look casual, your heart racing because this was a vulnerable moment. Then you'd need to leave the area without looking hurried, maintaining a natural pace when every instinct screamed at you to get away from this incriminating location immediately. Coded messages added mental strain to the physical discomfort. Information would be written in cipher or using code phrases that required memorization and mental effort to decode. You'd sit in your cramped room, dim light making it hard to see, working through the message painstakingly. Substitution codes meant replacing each symbol or character with another, a tedious process requiring total concentration. One mistake in decoding could completely change the meaning of your instructions, potentially leading to mission failure. The pressure to get it right, while working in poor conditions with tired eyes and a tired brain, was immense. Creating your own encoded reports was equally tedious. You'd need to remember everything you'd observed, then translate it into cipher before writing it down. This double mental effort, recall plus encoding, would take hours. Your hand would cramp from writing, because the writing implements available were brushes or basic pens that required constant attention to use properly. The ink would sometimes run or smudge, making you start sections over. You'd finish a report with hand cramps, eye strain from close work in poor light, and a headache from the mental effort. Let's discuss the wonderful reality of maintaining your cover identity's actual job while also doing ninja work. If you were disguised as a merchant, you needed to actually conduct enough trade to be convincing. This meant you were essentially working two jobs simultaneously. During the day, you'd sell goods, deal with customers, handle transactions, all the normal work of a merchant. This was physically tiring in its own right, standing for long hours, lifting and moving merchandise, talking constantly. Then, at night, you'd do your actual ninja work, the reconnaissance or infiltration or whatever your mission required. The sleep deprivation from this double life was brutal. You'd catch a few hours when you could, never getting a full night's rest because your schedule was dictated by mission needs rather than human biological requirements. Chronic short sleep made everything harder. Your thinking would be slower, your reaction time delayed, your mood worse. Simple tasks would become difficult because your brain was operating on insufficient rest. You'd make mistakes you normally wouldn't, forgetting details, misjudging distances, fumbling actions that should be automatic. But you couldn't stop because both your cover job and your real job required consistent performance. The financial aspect of maintaining a cover business was problematic too. You'd need to actually invest resources in your cover, buying inventory if you were a merchant, maintaining tools if you were a craftsman. This money came from your ninja earnings usually, meaning your actual job was funding your fake job. Sometimes the cover business would make enough to support itself, but often it operated at a loss that you had to absorb. You'd be paying for the privilege of working twice as hard as a normal person, which was galling when you thought about it too much. Now let's talk about the joys of local criminal elements, because cities had criminal organizations and you'd need to interact with them carefully. Thieves, smugglers, and various unsavory characters often had information that was valuable, but dealing with them was risky and unpleasant. Meetings would happen in terrible locations like back alleys, abandoned buildings, or areas of town where no sensible person went after dark. You'd stand in these locations, surrounded by refuse and who knew what else, trying to negotiate while staying alert for betrayal. The smell in these locations was typically appalling. Criminals chose meeting spots that were avoided by normal people, and they were avoided for good reasons. Back alleys were used as dumping grounds for all sorts of waste. The stench would be thick and complex, layers of rot and filth that would make your eyes water. You'd breathe through your mouth to minimize the smell, but then you'd taste it instead, which was arguably worse. The lingering flavor of alley meeting would stay with you for hours afterwards, a nasty reminder coating your tongue. The people themselves were often in poor physical condition and hygiene. Missing teeth, bad breath, skin conditions, all were common among people living rough criminal lives. They'd stand too close when talking, their breath washing over you in waves of uncomfortable odor. You'd resist the urge to step back, because showing discomfort could be seen as disrespect, and disrespecting criminals was a quick way to have a very bad time. So you'd stand there maintaining your position while every sense screamed at you to increase distance from this fragrant individual. Physical intimidation was common in these interactions. Criminals would try to establish dominance through aggressive body language, getting in your space, occasionally shoving or grabbing. You'd need to project enough confidence to not be seen as an easy victim, but not so much confidence that it was seen as a challenge. This balancing act was mentally exhausting and kept you in a state of high tension throughout these meetings. Your muscles would be taut, ready to react if things turned violent, maintaining this readiness that was tiring even though you weren't actually fighting. Let's discuss the reality of seasonal work patterns, because demand for ninja services wasn't constant throughout the year. Certain seasons were busier, usually corresponding with political activity and military campaigns. During busy periods you'd be overworked, multiple missions overlapping, barely any rest between jobs. Your body would accumulate damage and fatigue that you couldn't properly recover from. Old injuries would flare up, chronic aches would intensify, you'd be running on empty but still needing to perform at full capacity. Let's talk about the delightful reality of dealing with vermin. because anywhere humans lived in ancient Japan, rats, mice, and various insects also lived in abundance. As someone who spent time in ceiling spaces, under floors, in storage areas, and other neglected parts of buildings, you'd encounter these creatures constantly. Rats were bold and numerous, thriving on human waste and stored food. You'd hear them moving in the darkness, their claws scratching on wood, their squeaking communications echoing through wall spaces. Sometimes you'd feel them run across your body when you were hiding motionless, their small feet pattering over your legs or back as they went about their business. The sensation of a rat walking on you was uniquely unpleasant. You'd feel each tiny foot placement, the scratch of their claws, the weight shifting as they moved. You couldn't react, couldn't brush them away, because movement meant noise and discovery. So you'd lie there, feeling this creature explore your motionless body, sometimes pausing to sniff at your face or hands with their whiskers tickling your skin. The smell of rats was musky and strong, a concentrated mammal odor that would be particularly noticeable when they were close. After a night sharing space with rats, you'd carry their scent on your clothes, a funky aroma that would take multiple washings to fully remove. Mice were smaller but more numerous, their droppings littering any enclosed space. These droppings would get on your hands and clothes when you were crawling through confined areas. The little pellets would stick to your skin when you were sweating, creating a gritty coating that you'd need to scrub off later. The thought of what you'd been lying in or crawling through would occur to you afterwards, prompting vigorous washing that never quite made you feel clean. Some spaces would have accumulated layers of droppings over years, creating a crunchy carpet that compressed under your weight, with a subtle crackling sound that you'd pray wasn't loud enough to carry to anyone below. Insects were everywhere, and came in varieties that seemed specifically designed to make humans uncomfortable. Fleas were constant companions, living in fabrics, floors, and anywhere warm-blooded creatures spent time. You'd pick them up from the environments you infiltrated, bringing them back to your own space where they'd establish residence and feast on you regularly. The bites were small but intensely itchy, raised welts that you'd scratch unconsciously, often tearing the skin and creating small wounds that would then itch and sting. You'd be covered in bite marks in various stages of healing, your skin a constellation of red bumps and healing scabs. Lice were another charming problem, particularly if your mission required spending time among people living in crowded or poor conditions. These tiny parasites would transfer from person to person through close contact or shared fabrics. Once established in your hair or clothes, they'd be difficult to eliminate completely. The itching was constant and maddening, concentrated on your scalp or body where the lice fed. You'd feel them moving sometimes, a creeping sensation that would make your skin crawl. Treatment involved harsh methods like very hot water, strong-smelling substances, and sometimes just shaving affected areas completely, which wasn't ideal when you needed to maintain a specific appearance for your cover identity. Mosquitoes were seasonal, but during their active months they were absolutely relentless. When you were hiding motionless outdoors, you were essentially a buffet that couldn't fight back. They'd land on any exposed skin and feed freely while you remained frozen, unable to swat them away. The high-pitched whine of their flight would circle your head, landing on your ears, your neck, your face. Each bite would create an itchy welt, but you'd accumulate dozens or even hundreds during a long night outdoors. By morning, you'd be swollen and lumpy, your face barely recognizable under the accumulated bites, every inch of exposed skin inflamed and irritated. The itch from multiple mosquito bites would last for days, an ever-present background discomfort that would distract you from more important things. Scratching would provide momentary relief, but make the itching worse long term and risk infection if you broke the skin. You'd develop strategies to avoid scratching, keeping your hands busy, or bandaging particularly bad areas to prevent unconscious scratching during sleep. But the itch would persist, a low-level torture that wore down your patience and mood gradually but thoroughly. Spiders were common in the dark, neglected spaces you frequented. Most were harmless, but all were unsettling when encountered unexpectedly. You'd walk face first into webs regularly, the sticky strands clinging to your skin and pulling loose from their anchors with a sensation that would make you shudder. The web would stick to your face and hands, requiring picking and rubbing to remove all the strands. You'd imagine you could still feel it hours later, phantom web sensations making you brush at your face and hair repeatedly. Sometimes the spider would still be in the web when you hit it, ending up somewhere on your body, making you fight down panic while you located and removed it as calmly as possible. Now, let's discuss the wonderful experience of dealing with seasonal allergies and respiratory issues, because ancient Japan had plenty of pollen, dust and irritants, but no modern antihistamines or treatments. If you were prone to allergies, certain seasons would make your life particularly miserable. Your nose would run constantly, requiring frequent wiping that would leave your nostrils and upper lip raw and sore. Your eyes would water and itch, making them red and swollen. Sneezing fits would strike at the worst times, requiring superhuman effort to suppress when you needed to stay silent. The physical effort of suppressing sneezes was remarkable. You'd feel the sneeze building, that unstoppable rising sensation, and you'd have to short-circuit it through various techniques, pressing your tongue hard against the roof of your mouth, pinching your nose, controlled breathing, anything to stop the explosive release. Sometimes you'd succeed, but the suppressed sneeze would leave you feeling strange, the uncompleted reflex leaving your sinuses and chest feeling tight and uncomfortable. Sometimes you'd fail, and the sneeze would burst out, catastrophically loud in whatever silent space you were trying to hide in, and you'd freeze in horror waiting to see if you'd been discovered. Dust exposure in the ceiling spaces and crawl areas you frequented would irritate your lungs over time. You'd develop a chronic cough, a dry hack that would strike unpredictably. Coughing when you needed to be silent was a nightmare, requiring you to muffle it against your arm or chest, trying to make the explosive sound as quiet as possible. This muffled coughing would leave your throat sore and your chest aching from the repeated pressure. The irritation in your lungs would persist, making you conscious of your breathing, feeling the slight wheeze or rattle that indicated your respiratory system wasn't happy with the abuse you were subjecting it to. Smoke exposure was another respiratory problem, because ancient Japan used open fires for heating and cooking, filling enclosed spaces with smoke that had nowhere to go. When you were hiding in a ceiling space above a room where cooking was happening, you'd be breathing smoke-laden air for hours. The smoke would sting your eyes, make your nose run, and leave your throat scratchy and irritated. You'd suppress coughs constantly, your eyes streaming tears, barely able to see, but unable to leave your position until the mission was complete. After extended smoke exposure, your voice would be hoarse, and your lungs would hurt with each breath, feeling inflamed and angry at the insult. Now let's talk about the delightful experience of dealing with facial hair and grooming requirements, because your appearance needed to match your cover identity, but maintaining that appearance was uncomfortable and awkward. If your disguise required a beard, you'd need to grow and maintain one using tools that were basically sharp pieces of metal with minimal sophistication. Trimming a beard by feel without a proper mirror meant frequently nicking your face, small cuts that would sting when you sweated and take days to heal. The blade would pull at hairs rather than cutting them cleanly, creating a sensation that made your eyes water and left your face feeling raw. If your cover required being clean-shaven, you'd need to shave regularly with those same primitive tools. The blade would scrape across your skin, removing hair but also frequently removing small amounts of skin along with it. Shaving cream or soap helped, but wasn't always available, meaning you'd sometimes shave dry, the blade dragging and catching, leaving your face feeling like you'd rubbed it with rough stone. Your skin would be irritated and sensitive afterwards, tight and uncomfortable, stinging in the air. Sweat would find every microscopic cut, creating dozens of tiny burning sensations across your face. Maintaining hair length to match your identity meant cutting it yourself or trusting someone else with sharp implements near your head, neither option being particularly comfortable. Self-cutting meant working by touch, trying to achieve even length without being able to see properly what you were doing. You'd end up with uneven patches and spots you'd missed entirely, requiring multiple passes and corrections that would take far longer than the process should. Your arms would get tired from holding them up at odd angles, working on the back and sides of your head, muscles trembling from fatigue while you were still holding a sharp blade near your scalp. Body hair management was necessary in some situations, particularly if you were impersonating someone from a different social class that had different grooming standards. Removing body hair with ancient tools meant plucking, scraping, or using early depilatory pastes made from caustic substances that would burn your skin while dissolving the hair. The plucking method was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, each hair pulled individually, hundreds or thousands of small sharp pains that would leave your skin inflamed and bumpy. The scraping method would leave you raw and irritated. The chemical method would burn and sometimes cause rashes or reactions that would itch and hurt for days afterwards. Let's discuss the wonderful reality of dealing with changes in elevation and terrain during travel between locations. Missions often required traveling significant distances, and ancient Japan's geography meant hills, mountains, and rough terrain were unavoidable. Climbing steep paths with a pack of equipment meant your legs would burn with effort, your breathing would become labored, and your heart would pound so hard you could feel it in your throat. The thin air at higher elevations would leave you dizzy and slightly nauseous, your body struggling to extract enough oxygen from each breath. Descending steep paths was somehow worse because the impact on your knees and the constant bracing to prevent falling forward would destroy your legs in a different way. Your thighs would tremble from the sustained eccentric contraction, the muscles burning and threatening to give out. Your toes would jam into the front of your footwear with each downward step, becoming bruised and tender. By the time you reached the bottom of a long descent, your legs would feel like they belonged to someone else, shaky and unreliable, barely responding to your mental commands. Rocky terrain meant constant attention to foot placement, every step requiring assessment of the surface. Sharp rocks would press through your thin soles, creating points of pain that you'd try to avoid but couldn't always predict. Loose stones would shift underfoot, turning your ankle or causing you to lose balance and stumble. The constant micro-adjustments to maintain stability on uneven ground would fatigue your ankles and feet in ways that flat walking never did. After hours of rocky terrain, your feet would feel beaten and bruised, every step sending aches up through your legs. Muddy paths created their own challenges, the slippery surface making every step uncertain. You'd plant your foot and feel it slide, catching yourself before falling, but using extra energy in the process. The mud would accumulate on your footwear, adding weight and making your feet feel huge and clumsy. The extra effort of pulling your feet from sucking mud with each step would tire your legs quickly, turning what should be easy walking into exhausting labor. Your lower legs would be coated in mud splash, the wet grit working its way into any gap in your clothing, and irritating your skin with constant gritty contact. Stream crossings were frequent and always unpleasant. Water would be cold, shockingly so, numbing your feet within seconds of wading in. The current would push against your legs, requiring effort to maintain balance while your feet sought purchase on slippery rocks below the surface. You'd step carefully, feeling with your feet for stable positions, occasionally misjudging and plunging into deeper water that would soak you higher than intended. The rocks would be covered in slippery growth, your feet sliding unpredictably, your arms windmilling for balance. Getting across without falling was never guaranteed, and falling meant being completely soaked and miserable for the rest of the day. Now let's talk about the joys of dealing with blisters, because these would be your constant companions given the amount of walking, climbing, and general physical activity your work required. Blisters would form anywhere friction occurred repeatedly, which was basically everywhere. Your feet would develop them between your toes, on your heels, on the balls of your feet. Your hands would develop them on your palms from climbing and tool use. Even your shoulders and back could develop blisters from carrying packs or equipment that rubbed against your skin through clothing. The formation of a blister was a progressive experience you'd become intimately familiar with. First would come a hot spot, an area that was being rubbed raw where you'd feel increased warmth and tenderness. If you could stop the activity at this point, you might prevent the blister from forming fully, but you usually couldn't stop, so the hot spot would progress to a fluid-filled bubble, the skin separating from the layers beneath and filling the gap with clear liquid. This bubble would be tender and obvious, changing how you move to avoid putting pressure on it. But avoiding pressure on one blister meant shifting load to other areas, which would then develop their own blisters, creating a cascade of new hotspots and bubbles. Burst blisters were even worse than intact ones. The protective bubble of skin would tear, leaking fluid and exposing the raw, sensitive skin beneath. This exposed area would hurt intensely with any contact, feeling like an open wound, which essentially it was. Dirt and sweat would get into the burst blister, stinging and increasing the risk of infection. The ragged edges of torn blister skin would catch on fabric and pull, creating sharp pains that would make you gasp and curse. You'd try to protect burst blisters with fabric wrapping, but the wrapping would slip or bunch up, sometimes making the rubbing worse rather than better. Let's talk about the wonderful reality of smoke signals and fire-based communication methods, because sometimes missions required coordinating with others at a distance. Creating smoke signals meant starting and maintaining a fire in a location where you probably didn't want to be noticed, a contradiction that made the whole process stressful. You'd need to gather fuel that would produce the right type and color of smoke, damp leaves for white smoke, green wood for different effects. Your hands would get sticky with sap, covered in bits of bark and leaf debris that would stick to your skin and itch. Tending a signal fire meant staying close to it, breathing smoke constantly while you controlled the size and timing of smoke releases. Your eyes would stream tears from the constant smoke exposure. Your lungs would feel raw and irritated. The smell would permeate your clothes and hair, a wood smoke stench that would cling to you for days afterwards. Anyone you encountered would smell the smoke on you immediately, potentially compromising your cover if smoke smell didn't fit your supposed identity. You'd scrub and wash, but the smell would persist, embedded in fabric fibers and lurking in your hair, where it would release fresh waves of scent whenever you sweated. The heat from maintaining a fire, even a small signal fire, would be intense at close range. Your face would feel tight and hot, the skin drying out from the radiant heat. Sparks would occasionally pop out, landing on your clothes or skin, tiny burning points that you'd need to brush away quickly before they created holes or burns. The fire would need constant attention, feeding it fuel at the right rate, adjusting airflow, managing the smoke production. It was physical work that required focus, all while staying alert for anyone who might be approaching to investigate the smoke. Now let's discuss the joys of dealing with seasonal storms, because ancient Japan experienced powerful storms and you'd often be caught out in them. Typhoon season brought winds strong enough to knock you off your feet if you weren't braced properly, and rain that fell in solid sheets, making it almost impossible to see or breathe. Being outside during a serious storm was genuinely dangerous. Flying debris could cause injury. Flooding could sweep you away, and lightning strikes were a real risk. But sometimes missions couldn't be postponed for weather, so you'd be out in these conditions anyway, hoping you'd survive the night. The wind during a strong storm was a physical force that would push and pull at you, making simple walking exhausting. You'd lean into the wind to make progress, your muscles straining against the resistance. Then the wind would shift and you'd stumble forward as the pressure suddenly released. Your clothes would whip and snap, the wet fabric cracking like a whip against your skin, leaving stinging welts. Anything loose would be torn away, and you'd clutch your essential equipment to your body, arms aching from the sustained grip needed to prevent loss. The rain would be cold and relentless, soaking through everything within seconds. But it wasn't just wetness, it was water driven by wind with enough force to sting exposed skin. The drops would hit your face like tiny slaps, making you squint and turn your head to breathe. Water would run into your nose and mouth, making breathing difficult, each breath requiring timing to avoid inhaling water. You'd be coughing and choking while trying to navigate through near-zero visibility, every sense overwhelmed by the storm's assault. Lightning during storms created moments of stark terror. The flash would illuminate everything in harsh white light, destroying your night vision instantly and leaving you blind in the darkness that followed. The thunder would be deafening, a physical pressure wave you'd feel in your chest, making your ears ring. Close lightning strikes would make the air smell sharp and burnt, an acrid scent that would sting your nose. The knowledge that you might be struck, transformed into a charred corpse in an instant, would make every flash and crack a moment of pure fear that you'd have to push through to continue your mission. Let's talk about the experience of dealing with altitude sickness if your mission took you into mountainous regions. As you climbed higher, the air would become noticeably thinner, each breath providing less oxygen than your body was accustomed to. You'd find yourself breathing faster and deeper, trying to compensate, but it never quite felt like enough. Your head would begin to ache, a pressure behind your eyes that would build to a pounding headache that made it hard to think clearly. Your thoughts would become sluggish and confused, your decision-making impaired at exactly the time you needed to be sharp and alert. The fatigue at altitude was profound. Simple tasks would leave you winded and exhausted. Climbing stairs or steep paths would have you gasping for breath, your heart hammering, your legs feeling like they were made of lead. Your appetite would disappear even though you needed calories for the exertion. Food would seem unappealing, and eating would be a chore you'd force yourself through. Sleep would be difficult despite your exhaustion, the thin air making you feel like you were suffocating even while lying still. You'd wake frequently, gasping and disoriented, never getting the deep rest your body needed. Nausea was common at altitude, a queasy stomach that made the thought of food actively unpleasant. If it progressed to actual sickness, you'd find yourself retching and heaving, bringing up what little food you'd managed to eat, losing precious calories and fluid. The strain of being sick would leave your throat raw and your abdominal muscles sore, adding to your catalogue of discomforts. Recovering from altitude sickness required descending to lower elevations, which meant mission delay or failure. but continuing while seriously affected could be fatal. The decision of whether to push through or retreat was always difficult and always made, while your judgment was impaired by the very condition you were trying to assess. Now let's discuss the reality of dealing with foot problems beyond just blisters. Athlete's foot and other fungal infections thrived in the warm, moist environment of feet that were constantly in footwear, sweating, and exposed to damp conditions. The infection would start as itching between your toes, an irritating tickle that would make you want to remove your footwear and scratch vigorously. As it progressed, the skin would become white and soft, peeling away in soggy strips. The smell would become distinctly funky, a sour, yeasty odor that would be noticeable whenever you removed your footwear. The itching from fungal infections was intense and constant, a crawling sensation that demanded scratching. But scratching would damage the softened skin further, creating cracks and openings that would hurt and potentially let in other infections. The cracks would split with certain movements, sudden sharp pains as damaged skin tore. Walking would become uncomfortable as every step flexed your feet and stressed the cracked areas. Treatment required keeping feet dry, which was nearly impossible given your work conditions, and applying various antifungal preparations that were usually made from strong-smelling herbs or minerals that would sting when applied to broken skin. Plantar warts were another foot problem, caused by viral infections that would create hard, calloused lumps on the soles of your feet. These would be painless initially, but would grow and multiply if untreated. Walking on warts would eventually become painful as they grew inward, feeling like you were stepping on small stones embedded in your foot. The pressure of walking would push them deeper into the tissue, creating a pain that would build throughout the day as your feet took repeated impacts. Removal required cutting or burning them out, both options being extremely painful and leaving tender wounds on weight-bearing surfaces that would hurt for weeks as they healed. Now let's discuss the wonderful experience of dealing with sleep deprivation, because regular, adequate sleep was basically impossible in your profession. Your schedule was dictated by mission requirements, which often meant working at night, when targets were most vulnerable, and sleeping during the day when you could. But daytime sleep was difficult to achieve because the world was noisy and bright. People would be moving around, going about their business, making noise that would filter into your small room and prevent deep sleep. Light would leak through gaps in walls and around doors, enough to make the space too bright for quality rest. When you did manage to fall asleep during the day, you'd be awakened easily by sounds or disturbances. Every loud noise would jolt you awake, your heart pounding, your body tense and ready for danger before your mind fully registered what woke you. These repeated awakenings would fragment your sleep, leaving you in a state that wasn't quite rest and wasn't quite wakefulness. You drift through shallow sleep, never reaching the deep stages that actually restored your body and mind. Hours would pass, but you'd wake feeling like you'd barely slept at all, your body heavy and your thinking foggy. Chronic sleep deprivation had cumulative effects that would build over weeks and months. Your reaction time would slow, your movements would become sluggish, your coordination would deteriorate. Tasks that should be automatic would require conscious thought, and you'd make mistakes on simple actions. Your emotional regulation would suffer, making you irritable and short-tempered, snapping at minor irritations that wouldn't normally bother you. Your immune system would weaken, making you susceptible to every minor illness that came around. You'd catch colds more easily, they'd last longer, and you'd feel run down and miserable more often than not. The worst part of severe sleep deprivation was the micro-sleeps, brief moments where your brain would simply shut down for a few seconds without warning. You'd be doing something and would suddenly come to awareness with no memory of the last few seconds. If this happened while climbing or in another dangerous situation, the consequences could be fatal. You catch yourself nodding off at inappropriate times, your head dropping forward before jerking back up. The effort of staying awake when your body was screaming for sleep was immense, requiring constant movement and stimulation to prevent yourself from simply passing out where you stood. Let's talk about the joys of dealing with chronic dehydration, because access to clean water wasn't always guaranteed, and your work made you sweat constantly. Mild dehydration would start with thirst, an increasingly insistent dry mouth and throat. Your lips would become dry and chapped, cracking at the corners and bleeding when you opened your mouth too wide. Your tongue would feel thick and fuzzy, moving sluggishly in your dry mouth. Swallowing would become difficult, your throat sticking together uncomfortably. Your thinking would slow, your head would ache, and your energy levels would plummet. More severe dehydration would make your body start to shut down non-essential functions. Your sweating would decrease even though you were still hot, your body desperately conserving water. This made temperature regulation difficult, leaving you overheating but unable to cool down effectively. Your skin would lose elasticity, taking longer to smooth out after being pinched. Your eyes would feel dry and gritty, blinking becoming uncomfortable. Your urine would become dark and concentrated, with a strong smell that would embarrass you when you finally had access to toilet facilities. The dizziness from dehydration was particularly problematic for someone who needed to climb and balance. You'd stand up and the world would spin, your vision going dark around the edges. You'd need to steady yourself against something, waiting for the dizzy spell to pass before you could move safely. These episodes would strike without warning, making every transition from sitting to standing a moment of potential danger. Climbing while dehydrated meant fighting the dizziness while trying to maintain grip and balance, a terrifying combination that required intense focus to avoid falling. Muscle cramps were another joy of dehydration, sudden painful contractions that would seize a muscle and refuse to release. Your calf would suddenly knot up into a hard ball of agony, making you gasp and grab at it, trying to massage or stretch it back to normal. Cramps could strike anywhere: your feet, your hands, your thighs. Even your abdominal muscles would suddenly contract painfully. The cramps would last for seconds or minutes, intense pain that you couldn't really do anything about except wait for the muscle to decide it was done punishing you. Night cramps would wake you from what little sleep you were getting, the sudden pain dragging you into full awareness. Now let's discuss the reality of dealing with temperature extremes in your tiny living space. In summer, your small room would become an oven, the dark roof above absorbing heat all day and radiating it down into your space. The air would be thick and still, no breeze penetrating the enclosed space. Breathing would feel like inhaling hot soup, the air so warm it provided no relief. You'd sweat constantly, just sitting still, moisture running down your body and soaking into your sleeping mat. The wet fabric would be uncomfortable to sit or lie on, clammy and gross, but there was nowhere else to be. The heat would make sleeping nearly impossible. You'd lie on top of your mat, wearing as little as possible, and still feel like you were being slowly cooked. Every point of contact between your body and any surface would be hot and sweaty. You'd try to find positions where less of you was touching something, but you'd quickly discover there were no comfortable positions. Your mind would be sluggish from the heat, thinking becoming difficult, and you'd lie there in misery waiting for the temperature to drop enough to allow sleep. Often this wouldn't happen until nearly dawn, leaving you with perhaps an hour of sleep before the sun would heat your space again. Winter brought the opposite problem. Your thin walls provided almost no insulation, and heating options were limited because smoke and smell from a fire would be noticeable. You'd be cold constantly, a deep chill that would settle into your bones and never quite leave. Your fingers and toes would be numb most of the time, painful when you tried to warm them up. You'd layer whatever clothing you had, but it was never quite enough. The cold would make your muscles stiff and sore, movement becoming difficult and painful. Getting up in the morning would require a monumental effort of will, forcing yourself out of whatever meager warmth you'd accumulated under thin blankets into the shocking cold of the room. The cold would make your small space feel even more miserable and oppressive. Frost would form on the inside of walls overnight, ice crystals growing in any damp spots. Your breath would be visible, clouds of vapor with each exhalation. Any water in your space would freeze solid, meaning you'd need to thaw it before you could drink or wash. The cold would make every task harder, your numb fingers fumbling with tools and weapons, your stiff body moving slowly and clumsily. You'd dream of warmth, of comfortable rooms with proper heating, knowing these were luxuries you'd probably never experience. Let's talk about the wonderful experience of dealing with leeches if your mission involved swamps or wetland areas. These charming creatures would attach to any exposed skin or work their way inside your clothing to find skin underneath. You often wouldn't feel them attach because they secreted a numbing substance, so you'd only discover them later when you felt something wrong or saw them already fat with your drawn sustenance. The sight of a swollen leech attached to your body was deeply unpleasant, the bloated worm hanging off your skin, pulsing slightly as it fed. Now let's talk about the delightful reality of dealing with clothing damage and the challenges of maintaining your outfit. Your working clothes took enormous abuse from climbing, crawling, fighting through vegetation, and general hard use. Tears and holes would develop constantly, requiring frequent repairs that never quite restored the garment to its original integrity. Each repaired tear would be a weak point, slightly thicker and stiffer than the surrounding fabric, creating an uncomfortable ridge that would rub against your skin. After multiple repairs, your outfit would be more patch than original material, a patchwork of different fabric pieces that didn't quite match in color or texture. The knees and elbows of your outfit would wear thin first, the constant friction and pressure from crawling and climbing wearing through the fabric. You develop holes that would expand rapidly once they started, the edges fraying and tearing with each use. Cold air would whistle through the holes, or rain would soak through directly onto your skin. You'd patch them as best you could, but patches on high-stress areas wouldn't last long before they'd tear free or develop their own holes. Eventually you'd need to replace the entire garment, an expense that would strain your irregular income and require time to break in the new outfit, so it moved quietly and didn't restrict your movement. Stains were permanent features of your clothing, because the kind of dirt and substances you encountered didn't wash out easily. Mud would leave brown stains, tree sap would create sticky patches that attracted more dirt, and various fluids from the unsavory places you'd hide would leave marks that would never fully disappear. Your outfit would gradually become darker and more discolored, the original color visible only in protected areas that saw less wear and exposure. The stains would make your clothes stiff in places, the dried residue creating crusty patches that would crack and flake when you moved. The smell of your working clothes was truly remarkable, a combination of your own sweat, environmental odors absorbed during missions, and the general funk of fabric that got wet and dirty repeatedly but couldn't be properly cleaned. The smell would be particularly noticeable when the fabric was wet, releasing waves of concentrated stench as moisture reactivated dried deposits. You'd become somewhat nose-blind to your own smell, but would occasionally catch a whiff and realize just how unpleasant you must smell to others. This was actually useful for some disguises where you needed to appear as a beggar or vagrant, but less useful when you needed to blend in with normal society. Let's discuss the joys of dealing with bruised ribs, because impacts to your torso would happen regularly from falls, collisions, and fights. Bruised ribs would make breathing painful, each breath causing a sharp ache that would make you want to breathe shallowly. But shallow breathing meant inadequate oxygen, leaving you feeling short of breath and lightheaded. You try to breathe normally through the pain, each deeper breath sending stabbing sensations through your chest. Coughing or sneezing with bruised ribs was agonizing, the violent movement of your rib cage creating pain intense enough to make you gasp and see stars. Sleeping with bruised ribs was nearly impossible because lying down would put pressure on the damaged area. You try different positions, on your back, your side, propped up, none of them comfortable. Rolling over in your sleep would wake you with sudden sharp pain, leaving you gasping and clutching your side. The constant pain would prevent deep sleep, keeping you in light stages where you'd be aware of every ache. You'd wake after a night of this feeling more tired than when you'd lain down. Your body denied the rest it needed to heal. The bruising would take weeks to fully heal, weeks of painful breathing and poor sleep that would leave you exhausted and hurting. Binding your ribs for support would help somewhat, but created its own problems. The wrapping would restrict your movement and breathing, making you feel constricted and claustrophobic. The pressure would relieve some pain but create discomfort from the tightness. You'd need to re-wrap it regularly as it loosened, an awkward process that hurt as you pulled the bindings tight around your damaged ribs. Working with bound ribs would be difficult, your range of motion restricted, your breathing compromised, every movement reminding you of the injury. Now let's talk about the wonderful experience of dealing with contaminated water sources when clean water wasn't available. Sometimes you'd be desperate enough to drink from streams, ponds, or other sources that you knew were questionable. The water would often look fine, but would have an odd taste, slightly off in ways that made you suspicious, but not quite bad enough to make you spit it out when you were desperately thirsty. You drink it anyway, hoping your stomach was strong enough to handle whatever might be in it, knowing you might regret this decision in a few hours. When questionable water did make you ill, the experience would be thoroughly unpleasant. Your stomach would start to cramp, uncomfortable at first, but rapidly progressing to painful spasms that would double you over. You'd feel nauseated, a rising queasiness that would make you break out in cold sweat. The combination of cramping and nausea would leave you curled up in misery, unable to focus on anything except your rebellious digestive system. You'd make frequent urgent trips to the toilet facilities, your body forcefully rejecting the contaminated water and leaving you weak and shaky. The dehydration from illness would be severe, your body expelling water faster than you could replace it. You'd be desperately thirsty, but drinking more would often just start the cycle again, your stomach too irritated to handle even clean water. You'd be caught in a trap of needing hydration but being unable to keep anything down. Your mouth would be dry, your head would pound, and you'd feel weak and dizzy from fluid loss. Recovery would take days of careful sips and bland food, gradually coaxing your system back to normal function. During this recovery period, you'd be useless for missions, too weak and unstable to trust yourself with anything requiring physical or mental capability. Let's discuss the reality of dealing with splinters, because working with rough wood constantly meant picking up wood fragments embedded in your skin regularly. Small splinters would be annoying, creating little sore spots that would catch on fabric and sting when pressed. You try to dig them out with your fingernails or a needle, probing at your skin and often pushing the splinter deeper instead of extracting it. The area around a splinter would become inflamed and tender, your body reacting to the foreign object embedded in your flesh. Sometimes splinters would work their way out on their own over days, the skin pushing them to the surface where they could be easily removed. Larger splinters were more problematic, wood fragments an inch or longer driven deep into your palm or foot. These would hurt intensely, every movement causing pain as the wood shifted in your flesh. Extraction would be a painful process, requiring you to cut into your skin to grasp the splinter, then pull it out along the path it entered. The wood would often break during extraction, leaving pieces still embedded that would require further digging. The wound left behind would be deep and ragged, slow to heal and prone to infection. You'd need to clean it thoroughly despite the pain, flushing it with whatever clean water you had, and hoping you'd removed all the fragments. Let's talk about the wonderful experience of dealing with equipment failure at critical moments, because nothing you owned was particularly reliable. Rope would break when it was stressed beyond its capacity or had weakened from wear. You'd be mid-climb when you'd feel the rope start to give, fibers separating with small popping sounds that would spike your adrenaline instantly. The sickening sensation of your support beginning to fail would make your heart drop, and you'd need to immediately shift your weight to other holds or find alternative support before the rope gave out completely. Sometimes you'd succeed and could continue after your heart rate settled. Sometimes the rope would fail completely and you'd fall, the drop ending in impact and pain. Blade edges would chip or roll when they hit something harder than expected. You'd be using a knife or small sword and would feel the blade bite into unexpected resistance, the edge deforming instead of cutting. The damaged blade would be less effective, catching instead of slicing cleanly, requiring more force to accomplish the same task. Sharpening could restore some functionality, but if the damage was severe, the blade's geometry would be permanently altered. You'd be stuck with a compromised tool that you'd have to keep using, because replacement wasn't immediately possible, knowing it might fail you when you needed it most. Lockpicks would break inside locks, snapping under pressure and leaving a piece of metal stuck inside the mechanism. This would not only fail to open the lock, but would make it nearly impossible to try again because the broken piece would block your tools. You'd need to try to extract the broken piece, working blind, trying to manipulate something you couldn't see, with tools that weren't designed for this purpose. Sometimes you'd succeed after frustrating minutes of delicate work. Other times the pick would remain stuck and you'd have to abandon this approach entirely, all your careful work wasted and the mission compromised. Cloth would tear at the worst moments, usually under stress when you needed it to hold. A hood would rip when caught on something, your disguise suddenly compromised. Bindings would come loose during activity, whatever you'd secured beginning to shift and dangle. Your outfit would split at a seam during a stretch or climb, creating an embarrassing tear that would also compromise your protection from the elements. You'd need to stop and make quick repairs if possible, or work with the damaged equipment if stopping wasn't an option, knowing the problem would get worse with continued use. Now let's discuss the joys of dealing with territorial insects, particularly wasps and hornets, that would nest in exactly the sorts of locations you needed to access. Approaching an area that turned out to have a nest would immediately become dangerous. The insects would detect your presence through vibration or scent and would become aggressive, swarming out to defend their home. You'd need to retreat immediately, these insects moving far faster than you could, their angry buzzing filling the air around you. The first stings would be your warning that you'd made a serious mistake. Being stung multiple times in quick succession would be overwhelming, each sting a sharp spike of pain that would continue burning long after the initial strike. The stings would swell into large, hot lumps that would throb with your pulse. Your body would flood with histamine responses, making you feel hot and itchy all over. If you were stung many times, you might develop systemic symptoms, feeling dizzy, nauseous, and weak. Your breathing might become difficult as your airways swelled slightly in response to the venom load. You'd need to get away from the nest area and deal with a medical emergency, mission abandoned in favor of survival. Even a few stings would be debilitating for hours or days. The sites would remain painful and swollen, making movement uncomfortable if they were on joints or high movement areas. The itching would be intense, a maddening sensation that scratching would only amplify. You'd want to claw at the stings until you'd torn your skin, but you'd have to restrain yourself because damaging them would risk infection. The swelling could be grotesque, particularly on your face if you'd been stung there, your features distorting until you were barely recognizable. This would at least provide an excuse if you were supposed to be somewhere maintaining a cover identity, though explaining what happened would require a creative story. Let's talk about the reality of dealing with chronic inflammation from repeated minor injuries. Your joints would be chronically inflamed from constant stress, the tissue around them swollen and tender. This would make them stiff, particularly after rest, requiring a painful warm-up period before they'd move properly. Your hands would be perpetually puffy, your fingers slightly swollen, making fine motor control more difficult. Rings wouldn't fit, your fingers too thick from accumulated fluid and inflammation. Removing tight-fitting items would be difficult, because your swollen hands wouldn't compress as easily as normal. The inflammation would be worse in the morning after a night of immobility, your body stiffening up as you rested. You'd wake feeling like you'd aged decades overnight, your joints creaky and painful, your muscles tight and resistant to movement. The first movements of the day would be accompanied by alarming cracking and popping sounds as joints realigned and released trapped gas. You'd need to move slowly and carefully until your body warmed up and loosened, the process taking longer as you accumulated more damage over time. By the time you felt relatively normal and mobile, it might be midday, half your waking hours spent dealing with your body's protest about yesterday's activities. Anti-inflammatory treatments were limited and not particularly effective. You might use cooling cloths on swollen areas, which would provide temporary relief but wouldn't address the underlying problem. Certain herbs were thought to reduce inflammation when consumed or applied, but their effectiveness was questionable at best. Mostly you'd just endure the inflammation as a constant state of being, your body perpetually trying to heal from insults that kept being reapplied before healing could complete. The inflammation would contribute to your chronic pain, another thread in the tapestry of discomfort that was your daily existence. Now let's discuss the wonderful experience of dealing with teeth problems, because dental care was essentially non-existent, and your teeth would deteriorate over time. Tooth pain was uniquely terrible, a sharp, drilling sensation that would radiate through your jaw and into your head. A bad tooth would throb with your heartbeat, each pulse sending a wave of pain through your face. The pain would make it impossible to think about anything else, dominating your awareness and making concentration impossible. You'd try to work through it, but would be largely useless, the pain overwhelming your ability to focus on tasks. Eating with tooth pain would be agonizing, every bite potentially hitting the damaged tooth and sending a lightning bolt of pain through your skull. You'd try to chew on the other side of your mouth, but you'd inevitably misjudge and bite down on the bad tooth, the resulting pain making you gasp and possibly cry. Hot or cold foods would trigger intense sensitivity, the temperature change causing the damaged nerve to scream. You'd be reduced to eating soft room temperature foods, making your already bland diet even more limited and unpleasant. Now let's discuss the wonderful reality of dealing with the aftermath of missions that went wrong. Sometimes you'd be detected or identified, requiring a rapid escape that would be panicked and desperate rather than calm and controlled. Running at full speed through unfamiliar terrain in darkness would be terrifying, every step a potential disaster. You'd crash through obstacles you couldn't see, branches whipping your face, roots catching your feet. The sound of pursuit behind you would spike your fear, adrenaline flooding your system, your heart hammering so hard it hurt. Your breathing would be ragged gasps, your lungs burning as you pushed your body beyond its comfortable limits. The physical toll of a panicked escape would be severe. You'd pull muscles in your desperate sprint, feel tendons strain from awkward movements made at full speed. You'd fall and catch yourself with your hands, scraping palms roar against ground you couldn't see. Your shins would collect impacts from stumbling over obstacles, the bruises blooming immediately. When you finally stopped, having put enough distance between yourself and pursuit, you'd collapse in exhaustion, your whole body shaking from exertion and fear. Your muscles would cramp from the intense effort, painful spasms that would lock up your legs and make you gasp and grip the affected areas. The recovery from a failed mission would take days. Your body would be battered and bruised from the escape, every movement reminding you of impacts and strains. Your muscles would be incredibly sore from the intense exertion, that deep ache that made climbing stairs nearly impossible. You'd be jumpy and on edge, startled by normal sounds, your nervous system wound tight from the fear of discovery. Sleep would be difficult, nightmares replaying the pursuit, your mind processing the trauma. You'd wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, taking minutes to calm down and convince yourself you were safe. The mental impact of close calls would accumulate over time. Each near discovery would add to your baseline anxiety, making you more cautious but also more paranoid. You'd second guess your decisions, replay missions in your mind looking for mistakes, obsess over details that might have given you away. This constant mental rehashing would be exhausting, your brain unable to let things go, always analyzing and worrying. The stress would make you less effective, your heightened anxiety actually making you more likely to make mistakes, creating a difficult cycle to break. Let's talk about the joys of dealing with having to dispose of evidence or items that connected you to missions. Sometimes this meant getting rid of things that were valuable or useful, destroying your own equipment because keeping it would be too risky. You'd need to break down tools, burn documents, dispose of materials in ways that ensured they couldn't be traced back to you. This was frustrating, watching resources you'd invested in go up in smoke or sink into a river. The practical loss was bad enough, but the waste rankled, knowing you'd need to replace these items eventually, and they didn't come cheap. Bodies were occasionally a disposal problem, though this wasn't common. When it did happen, the reality was nothing like fiction made it seem. Moving a body was difficult, the weight awkward and uncooperative, limbs flopping and making the whole thing unwieldy. The smell would be immediate and unpleasant, bodily functions releasing in death, creating odors that would make you gag. Your hands would shake from adrenaline and stress, making the already difficult task even harder. Finding a disposal method that would keep the remains hidden long enough for you to be beyond suspicion required planning and effort, all while dealing with the psychological weight of what you were doing. The psychological impact of killing, even when necessary for survival or mission completion, would be significant. The moment of taking a life would replay in your mind, uninvited and intrusive. You'd see their face, remember the look in their eyes, the sounds they made. These memories would surface at random times, disrupting your thoughts and disturbing your peace. Some ninja might become hardened to this, viewing it as just another aspect of the work. Others would carry the weight of each life taken, the accumulated guilt and trauma building over time. There was no counselling, no way to process these experiences except to push them down and try to move forward. Now let's discuss the reality of dealing with injuries that needed to stay hidden. If you were injured during a mission but needed to maintain your cover identity, you'd have to hide the injury while it healed. A limp would need to be suppressed, forcing yourself to walk normally despite the pain. Facial injuries would need to be explained away with creative stories, or covered with cloths if explanations wouldn't work. The constant effort of hiding pain and injury while also allowing them to heal properly was exhausting, and often meant injuries took longer to recover because you couldn't rest them adequately. Bandages and bindings would need to be hidden under clothing, creating bulk that might be noticeable. You'd wrap injuries as minimally as possible to reduce visibility, but this meant less support and protection than would be ideal. The compromise between treating injuries properly and maintaining your cover would often mean choosing to let things heal more slowly and painfully, rather than risk exposure. This was particularly frustrating because you'd know exactly what you should be doing to heal, but couldn't do it because it would give you away. Pain management was limited to whatever you could tolerate silently. Making sounds of pain would draw attention and questions. You'd need to maintain a calm expression while agony radiated through injured areas. The mental discipline required to present normally while in serious pain was enormous, requiring constant focus and energy. You'd be exhausted at the end of each day just from the effort of appearing fine when you absolutely weren't. The few times you could let your guard down and acknowledge the pain in the privacy of your room would be profound relief, finally able to grimace and groan without worrying about witnesses. Let's talk about the wonderful experience of dealing with damaged fingernails from climbing and manual labor. Your fingernails would take enormous abuse, catching on things, tearing, breaking, getting pushed back into the nail bed. A torn fingernail would be incredibly painful, the sensitive nail bed exposed and raw. The torn nail would catch on everything: fabric, rope, tools, each snag sending sharp pain through your finger. You'd need to trim away the damaged part, cutting as close to where it had torn as possible, but this would leave an irregularly shaped nail that would continue to catch and cause problems. Fingernails pushed back from impact would create intense localized pain and would often develop bruising under the nail. The trapped material under the nail would create pressure, a throbbing ache that would persist for days. Sometimes the pressure would be severe enough that the nail would need to be pierced to release it, a procedure you'd perform on yourself that was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. You'd heat a needle until it was nearly red, then press it through the nail into the bruised area beneath, creating a small hole that would release pressure and provide relief. The smell of burning nail would make you gag, and the sensation of the hot needle penetrating was uniquely horrible. Let's talk about the wonderful experience of dealing with the constant need to gather and maintain multiple sets of disguise materials. Each cover identity required its own costume and props, and storing all of this in your tiny living space was a nightmare of organization. You'd have merchant clothes, beggar rags, priest robes, laborer outfits, each taking up precious space. The fabrics would pick up each other's smells when stored together, creating odd scent combinations that would sometimes compromise the authenticity of a disguise. Your merchant outfit would smell faintly of the beggar rags, requiring you to air it out before use, and hope no one noticed the underlying funk. The maintenance of these costumes was constant work. Each needed to look appropriate for its role, which meant different levels of cleanliness and repair. Merchant clothes needed to be relatively clean and well maintained to appear prosperous. Beggar rags needed to be strategically dirty and torn to appear destitute. Getting the level of wear correct for each role required judgment and constant adjustment. You'd artificially age and dirty some items while carefully preserving others, juggling these contradictory maintenance tasks in your limited space. The smell of fabric dye and various aging treatments would fill your room, adding to the general unpleasant atmosphere. Props for each identity needed to be convincing and appropriate. A merchant needed actual merchandise, samples of goods that looked well-traveled and authentic. These items would clutter your space, creating an obstacle course of objects you'd need to navigate around. A priest needed religious items, texts and implements that needed to appear well used and genuine. A performer needed instruments or equipment that you'd need to actually know how to use convincingly. The accumulation of props would gradually consume your living space, leaving less and less room for you until you felt like a stranger in your own residence, surrounded by the paraphernalia of fake identities. Now let's discuss the joys of dealing with the need to rapidly change between identities. Sometimes missions required switching disguises quickly, transforming from one persona to another in minimal time. You'd find a secluded spot and frantically change clothes, your fingers fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings in your haste. Items would fall from pockets and need to be retrieved from the ground. You'd tangle yourself in fabric, arms stuck in sleeves, head emerging from wrong openings. The stress of potentially being discovered mid-change would make you clumsy and panicked, taking longer than it should and leaving you disheveled and not quite right. Your appearance would need to change along with your clothes. Facial hair would need to be added or removed quickly using adhesives or coverings that were never quite convincing up close. The adhesive would itch and pull at your skin, and you'd worry constantly that your fake beard was visibly fake or coming loose. Changing your posture and movement patterns to match different identities was mentally taxing, requiring you to consciously alter your natural movements. You'd need to remember to limp if this identity had a leg injury, or stoop if this identity was elderly, maintaining these affectations constantly while also focusing on your actual mission objectives. The psychological strain of maintaining multiple identities would accumulate over time. You'd start to lose track of which mannerisms belong to which identity, occasionally mixing them up and having to quickly correct. Your real personality, whoever that was underneath all the roles, would become unclear even to yourself. You'd catch yourself using a cover identity's speech patterns in your own internal monologue, your thoughts colonized by your characters. The boundary between performance and reality would blur, leaving you uncertain about which parts of your behavior were authentic and which were just well-practiced acts that had become habits. Let's talk about the reality of dealing with having to eat and drink in character, when your cover identity would consume different things than you normally would. A merchant might drink alcohol socially, requiring you to consume enough to maintain appearances, but not so much that your judgment and reflexes were compromised. The alcohol would burn going down, warm your stomach, and gradually fuzz your thinking in ways that made you nervous. You'd need to be constantly aware of your consumption, nursing drinks to slow your intake, while appearing to participate normally in social drinking. Some covers required eating foods you found unpleasant or that disagreed with your stomach. You'd force down meals that made you gag, maintaining a pleasant expression while your throat rebelled against swallowing. Your stomach would protest later, cramping and gurgling as it processed food it really didn't want. You'd spend hours being uncomfortable, your digestion upset, while still needing to maintain your cover and complete your mission. The combination of physical discomfort and the mental effort of staying in character would exhaust you more thoroughly than physical labor. Fasting for religious cover identities would leave you weak and irritable. You'd go days consuming minimal food while still needing to function physically and mentally. The hunger would be intense, your stomach a constant ache, your thoughts increasingly dominated by fantasies of food. Your energy would plummet, making physical tasks require enormous effort. Your mood would deteriorate, your temper short, having to consciously suppress your irritation to maintain your character as a peaceful, holy person. The contradiction between how you felt and how you needed to appear would create internal tension that made the whole experience even more miserable. Now let's discuss the wonderful experience of dealing with the aftermath of physical confrontations. Fighting, even when you won, would leave you battered and hurt. Your knuckles would be split and swollen from impacts, the skin torn and the joints painfully inflamed. Punching someone hurt your hand almost as much as it hurt them, the impact shocking up through your bones. Your knuckles would be too swollen and painful to make a fist properly for days afterwards, compromising your ability to fight again or even to grip tools effectively. The skin splits would weep and need to be kept clean, difficult when your work required using your hands constantly. Body shots received during fighting would leave massive bruises across your torso, purple and yellow stains that would be tender for weeks. Breathing would hurt if your ribs had taken impacts, each breath reminding you of the fight. The bruises would be so extensive that you'd struggle to find positions that didn't press on a tender area. Sleeping would be challenging, waking up whenever you rolled onto a bruised section. The visible marks would be difficult to hide if you needed to change clothes around others, potentially compromising your cover if fighting injuries didn't match your supposed identity. Head impacts would leave you dizzy and confused, possible concussions that you'd have to just work through. Your vision would be blurry, your balance uncertain, your thinking muddy and slow. Nausea would come in waves, making you break out in cold sweat and struggle not to be sick. But you'd need to keep functioning, completing your mission or making your escape, despite your compromised state. The symptoms might last for days, gradually improving but leaving you feeling fragile and vulnerable. Multiple concussions over time would have cumulative effects, your thinking becoming permanently slower, your memory less reliable, the damage building each time your brain was rattled in your skull. Now let's talk about the wonderful reality of dealing with having to maintain awareness of local political situations that could affect your missions. The complex relationships between rival groups, shifting alliances and ongoing disputes were all relevant to your work, requiring you to stay informed about developments. This meant listening to gossip, reading whatever written materials you could access, and piecing together a coherent picture from fragmentary information. The mental effort of tracking all these interconnected relationships and predicting how they might evolve was exhausting, like playing a complex game where the rules kept changing and the consequences of misunderstanding were potentially fatal. Political changes could invalidate your current mission or make it dramatically more dangerous without warning. An alliance forming between groups might mean your target suddenly had new protection. A falling out might create unexpected opportunities, but also increase security and paranoia. You'd need to constantly reassess your plans based on the evolving situation, adapting on the fly when circumstances shifted. The uncertainty was stressful, never knowing if the information you were basing your decisions on was still current or had been superseded by recent developments you hadn't heard about yet. The complexity of maintaining your cover story increased with political awareness, because you needed to have opinions and knowledge appropriate to your supposed identity. A merchant would know different things than a priest, would care about different political developments, would have different loyalties and concerns. Getting this wrong, expressing knowledge or opinions that didn't fit your character, could expose you as something other than what you claimed. The mental load of maintaining consistent characterization that matched current political reality was another layer of complexity added to your already overwhelming cognitive burden. Let's discuss the joys of dealing with seasonal disease outbreaks that would sweep through communities. Disease was common and deadly, spreading through populations with no real understanding of how to prevent transmission. You'd be exposed constantly through your work in crowds and close spaces, your chances of infection high. When you did fall ill with something serious, you'd have no effective treatment, just folk remedies that might help but probably wouldn't. You'd lie in your small space, feverish and miserable, hoping your body could fight off the infection, while knowing that many people died from the same illnesses you were experiencing. The fear during serious illness was intense because you'd have no way to predict if you'd recover or if this was the illness that would end you. You'd feel yourself getting weaker, your body losing the fight, unable to do anything except wait and hope. Delirious fever would make you hallucinate and lose track of reality, time becoming fluid, your small room transforming into strange spaces populated by people who weren't there. You'd emerge from these episodes confused and frightened, uncertain how much time had passed or what you might have said or done while not in your right mind. Recovery from serious illness would be slow and frustrating. Your strength would be gone, simple tasks leaving you exhausted and shaking. Your weight would have dropped alarmingly, your clothes hanging loose, your face gaunt and hollow. Building back to your previous capability would take weeks or months of gradual effort, each small improvement feeling inadequate because you'd remember being so much more capable before. During this recovery period, you'd be unable to accept missions, your income stopping while your expenses continued, creating financial stress on top of your physical weakness. Now let's talk about the reality of dealing with betrayal, because your profession involved people selling information and services, and loyalty was always negotiable. You'd worry constantly that someone in your network might betray you, selling your identity or information about your missions to interested parties. The paranoia was justified because it definitely happened, ninja selling out their colleagues for money or to save themselves. You trust no one completely, always maintaining mental contingencies for what you'd do if someone turned on you. This lack of trust would make every interaction slightly stressful, never able to fully relax, even with people who were supposedly on your side. When betrayal did happen, either to you or to someone you knew, it would confirm your worst fears and make you even more paranoid. You'd second-guess every interaction, looking for signs of duplicity, exhausting yourself with constant suspicion. The mental energy spent on this vigilance was considerable, another drain on your limited cognitive resources. You'd become cynical and jaded, expecting the worst from people because experience had taught you that the worst often happened. This mindset would make you effective at protecting yourself, but would deepen your isolation, pushing away even the limited human connection you might otherwise have had. The knowledge that you might need to betray others if circumstances demanded it would create moral conflict. Could you sell out a colleague if doing so would save your own life? Most people would claim they wouldn't, but when actually faced with the choice, survival instinct might override loyalty. Living with this uncertainty about your own character was uncomfortable, not knowing if you'd uphold your principles when truly tested, or if you'd discover you were exactly as untrustworthy as everyone else. The question would remain theoretical until it wasn't, and you'd almost prefer not to find out the answer. Let's discuss the wonderful experience of dealing with the gradual erosion of your moral boundaries. Your work required lying, stealing, sneaking, and occasionally violence. Each act individually might seem necessary and justified, but the accumulation would gradually change who you were as a person. The first time you did something questionable, you'd feel guilt and conflict. The 10th time, less so. The 100th time, it would be routine, just part of the job. You'd notice yourself becoming comfortable with actions that once disturbed you, and this realization would be unsettling in its own way. The person you'd been before this life would become increasingly distant and unfamiliar. You'd struggle to remember what it felt like to be normal, to have simple concerns and honest relationships. The skills and mindset required for ninja work would seep into all aspects of your personality, making it difficult to turn off the paranoia and deception, even in situations that didn't require it. You'd lie automatically, your first instinct in any interaction being to manage information rather than communicate honestly. This automatic dishonesty would become so ingrained you'd sometimes forget you were doing it. The question of whether you were still a good person, or if you'd ever been one, would surface during quiet moments of self-reflection. You'd justify your actions as necessary, as serving larger purposes, as just doing your job. But the justifications would feel increasingly hollow as the bodies and betrayals accumulated. You'd avoid thinking too deeply about the morality of your choices, because doing so would make continuing impossible, and you needed to continue because this was all you knew and all you were good at. The mental gymnastics required to maintain your self-image while doing questionable things was exhausting and never fully successful.